Hi, everyone. Good to see you. As my name is Annie Gibson. I am the Director of Study Abroad at Tulane University in New Orleans. And today I'm going to speak from the perspective of my administrative hat. I teach at Tulane as well in Spanish and Portuguese and in the School of Social Innovation. And my research is on issues of immigration, performance of identity, and intercultural learning. But today, in particular, I want us to think a bit about what it's like to administer programs through the neo-colonial experience of a university. So today, what I want to consider is ways in which you all might frame some of the histories of our field as a way to kind of think about ways of moving forward and challenging some of the issues of collaboration, some administrative tensions that come up when we are trying to bridge the gap at times between international education and the work happening in diversity, equity, and inclusion across campuses, and hopefully think through some strategies to move forward as we are administering offices like Study Abroad and dealing with mass study abroad, as I do, the neo-colonial student, most who think about study abroad as a way to, travel to do the grand European tour, which are the lens of study abroad that this conference is about challenging. How do we sort of move the needle while also being the middleman in the machine? So I think when working with students and when we're working with faculty and staff, one of the things that I find useful is to start with the historical context. And we all know this here at APLAC, but sometimes naming and articulating the ways in which the history of our field has developed helps us articulate why there are these structural reasons why change is often difficult to think through. And I'm going to start with this quote from Michelle Tolan Tomasi, which was in a NAFSA publication. And she says that study abroad programs were built for inequity. Like it or not, international study was built for and sustained by the elite. Acknowledging this outright may open our sightline to the concrete ways our education abroad origin story still influences the status quo. Despite our thirst for difference, international educators are inculcated by decades. I lost my power here, and I don't have it off the top of my head. Let's see if it'll come up. Okay. Sure. So great. So I'll finish reading and then we can move forward. Perfect.
Can you see this?
Yeah. So despite our thirst for difference, international educators are inculcated by decades of programming designed for the most privileged students in the most privileged societal spheres abroad. From our financial aid processes to admission criteria to visa requirements to security procedures, we rely on systems designed to support an archetype that doesn't represent most US students. That is, of course, systemic bias, and we have to start the conversation by saying so. And I think that starting with what the staff we're working with the faculty that we're training, and having us all think, myself included, over and over again, how am I a cog, a wheel, part of this wheel, and what is my role in breaking it? And transforming it. And it is quite difficult. It's learning the system as best as you can from inside in order to find your positionality for change. So next slide, please. So a couple of things, the timeline for study abroad, acknowledging that structurally has been founded by the US Department of State is an important place to begin, I think, because it helps us understand ways in which the structures of our field are based. And so when we think about this timeline that you see here, the US hegemony in terms of why as an institution within the university, international education began, why area studies programs began, why intercultural communication as a field began, is inherently based in a particular structure that we need to acknowledge in order to find ways of pushing it and moving forward. And so here are a few examples of this, of how sort of the training and learning to put a de-emphasis on racial bias and an emphasis on ways of bridging become part of how our field was defined. And then I put in 2000 the establishment of Benjamin Gilman International Scholarship for Diversifying Study Abroad, because it was not until the early 2000s that at the government level, the State Department level, that we really start kind of acknowledging a discussion about diversity in study abroad, or thinking about mobility or other ways of international education beyond mobility. These are all very new discussions in our thought process. So how does this history present challenges for us now? The two fields are often work separately. Next slide, please. The development of the development of international education and diversity, equity, and inclusion have come out of different historical lines. We have civil rights in one context, and then we have peace building ideas and diplomacy in another. And so the fact that these historical lines have been separate create ways structurally in our institutions where sometimes the conversations can be challenged or can kind of connect, but also divide. And so international education is often critiqued from the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens as at times being privileged, as being elitist, as being over-focused on learning about national cultural frameworks, and sidestepping power and privilege. And it's all too often this idea of kind of, we're going to learn about different cultures so that we can get along when we think about intercultural communication, rather than addressing directly those power imbalances. And then vice versa, in the field of international education, when we're engaging with change leaders on campuses that are engaged with diversity, equity, and inclusion, at times there's international education can address this as seeing race, ethnicity, power, and privilege, and even social justice in the US context without showing the broader global context of these things. And so wrongfully applying US domestic concerns around power and privilege to other parts of the world where that is more, where there are many more nuances. And so without kind of bridging these two, there can be periods of kind of missing each other and instead of growing together. So international education, seeing in the mission statements of your university is the glamorous asset to the university, is the thing that all students will engage with to become global citizens, mostly through mobility, and which is not obviously accessible to all. And international and EDI is holding your university accountable, right? Is challenging the status quo. And our goal, I think, as educators, is really to think about where do these two things actually collide, and how do we move through them? Next slide, please. So structurally, what happens is often you will find that international education offices and diversity, equity, inclusion offices and initiatives are happening in silos in two different places, or even international education is siloed within different schools and departments. Hannah and I in this conversation have been talking about that in the case of Tulane. And so what this talks about is, you see that EDI and international education at times are fighting over the same resources. There might be perceived competition for space within the curriculum to define, what core curriculum requirements are, or how to get yourself into the strategic plan. And there can be a general lack of understanding about the approach and philosophy of each other's work when you don't see that sort of global local connection, where you don't acknowledge the histories that developed kind of in similar lines, but with different goals. Next slide, please. So there are many shared goals for international education and for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think focusing on that is one of the solutions of stepping forward when you're engaging with your colleagues across institutions. So experiential and transformative learning is at the forefront of pedagogies in both fields, promoting interdisciplinary and critical pedagogy, as well as the fact that both of these international education and EDI initiatives have existed at the periphery of institution, but we're in this moment where they're taking center stage crucially. And so figuring out ways to kind of highlight that at the moment. Next slide. So as someone who leads an international education office, one of the ways that I think is kind of the first step of working through making the commitment to a bridge in this is creating learning goals that all can understand across the university, and that faculty, staff, students can connect to, and that relate the pedagogies of many different class contents to. And so if you're in an international study abroad office, if you're a faculty that is leading a program, if you're a student that is trying to do your pre-departure work, having these learning goals where you center privilege and power, where you center student strengths around difference rather than barriers, but you also center assets, where you engage critically in self-reflection. We're seeing this over and over, building capacity for engaging difference, talking critically about intergroup dynamics. Much of study abroad, as we know, especially in these short-term programs that operate in a bubble, much of the intercultural learning, in fact, is engaging in an intensive way with that particular group. And so it's a missed opportunity to not think about global and EDI issues within your intergroup dynamics. And of course, host community impact, thinking about imbalances, which we've seen in many of these presentations. And a constant challenge of neo-colonial mentalities. And number one is accepting that we are that, I am that, right? And saying it outright. Next slide, please. Ways in which there are sort of frameworks for doing this as you're developing study abroad. For those of you that know me through APLAC, this sort of pre, during, and post framework has been one of the ways in which I've sort of turned the ethnographic method towards everything that we do, from how you organize a study abroad advising office, to how you organize a program, to how you organize shifts that you're going to make in your strategic plan. Is really thinking about the importance of reflection at all stages. I mentioned already that while we have to talk about barriers to mobility or barriers to access, in the same line, we need to talk about the benefits and the assets that are brought to talking the language of the institution, to the community, to the student group, by having these diverse students. A big one for me was thinking about discussions of ableism within the context of mobility. That for me was one of my blind spots for a while in terms of thinking about how we're talking about decolonizing the curriculum. And so thinking about ways in which ableism is so much embedded in how we think about intercultural learning. And empowering students with the frameworks and intentional space to reflect on this. And finally, I think that the knowledge of understanding how data works at an institution, being able to speak the language of the machine, becomes very important to social justice campaigns, and knowing your position within it. So using your positionality, for those of you that are in positions of administration, to think about ways where the more that you know the system, the more that you can work the data to then create an opportunity and to speak the language that the institution understands, to open voices for others, becomes particularly important. And data work has been a way in which I've really had to up my skills in order to create more opportunities for voices to be heard. Next slide, please. So curriculum development, for those that are talking at the higher level with their institutions, how are we incentivizing faculty to engage in this? How are we incentivizing a social justice curriculum? That our practices are engaging critical pedagogy. We just heard about the theater of the oppressed. Incorporating a power and privilege analysis into our cross-cultural training, and it happens on all levels, faculty, staff, and students. And continuing to find the common grounds between the international education initiatives and the equity, diversity, inclusion initiatives on your campus. And so that's a kind of a constant assessment and reassessment of your institution's commitment to social justice and inclusion. Next slide. So with that, I welcome a discussion of the intersections between social justice, international education, and equity, diversity, and inclusion.